If you're worried about the state of the world, I want to give you a warning. Because this week on the Politics Hub, we didn't shy away from some of the big global issues that politicians are wrestling with. Climate change, a world increasingly on the move, economies built on debt. Gordon Brown is so worried about the state of the world that he's written a book called Permacrisis. But don't worry, he told me his plan to fix it. The government has their own solution, including a plan from the Home Secretary to tear up long-standing international protection for refugees. And we've also had contrasting reactions to the suspensions at GB News over offensive remarks made by two of their presenters. Ofcom have now announced they are investigating. First, though, let's hear from the former Prime Minister, who explained to me what exactly a permacrisis is.
Yeah, by permacrisis, we mean you just look around the world. You've had a COVID crisis, a climate crisis, you've got debt, recessions, you've got wars. And I wanted, and the other authors, Mohammed El-Arian and Michael Spence, we wanted to give people hope that things can be done, that things can change, that things can get better, and that the desolation and desperation at the moment can pass if we do the right things. But yes, what's changed in the last 10 years, maybe even in the last 5 years, is that we're now dealing with not just common problems or shared problems, we're dealing with global problems that cannot be solved. Climate change, infectious diseases, financial stability, they cannot be solved without coordinated global action. And what's really sad is that the gap, if you like, between the need for that action and people's willingness to do it is so big, probably bigger than at any time since 1945. So what we're suggesting is, look, here are positive solutions to some of the problems, but you need to get together to actually make them work.
Today, Rishi Sunak has given the green light to one of the largest untapped oil and gas fields, Rosebank. Is that something you support?
Well, I think what you've got to think of is, are you going to be cutting carbon emissions over the next few years? And you've got to say that you're taking measures to do that. If you are, you're still using oil. So the question is whether the oil comes from Saudi Arabia or from another oil producer, or whether it comes from the North Sea. And when you look at Britain's balance of payments position, it's far better for the oil to come from the North Sea than to come from Saudi Arabia.
So you actually think Rosebank maybe, for our own energy security...
I don't think this should be an ideological issue, because you must say that you've got a plan to cut carbon emissions. I think that's the problem that he's got, that he announced proposals on electric cars that were to be delayed. He announced proposals on heating pumps to be delayed. And I think people doubt whether he can meet the targets that he set. If you're serious about cutting carbon emissions, and we can do it, then it doesn't seem to me to be an ideological question if you've got to use some oil, where that oil comes from, and surely it is far better for it to come from Britain at the benefit to our balance of payments, even if we're selling it abroad, rather than from Saudi Arabia. So I do think there's a common sense solution to this. And of course, there's jobs in the North Sea. You've got to always be aware, you know, when you're making big changes, and we are making big changes, look what happened to the mining industry and the damage that was done to so many families when we pulled out of coal, and we didn't do the transition properly. Now we've got a transition from oil and gas, and you really have got to bear in mind that there are livelihoods also dependent on what happens in the North Sea, and particularly in Aberdeen and the North East, but it goes right down to the North East of England. And so we should be aware that you've got to give a proper transition for people in these jobs.
It feels to me like the big challenge for whoever wins the next election is how to balance the kind of creaking public services that many people say are crying out for investment with an economy that, as you say, is low growth, high levels of debt. What should you do?
Well, we need to back the clusters of economic growth. You know, we've got some great innovation. I mean, I go around...
What does that mean? Does that mean investment? Does that mean spending and not being scared about debt in the right areas?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. You need to encourage investment in the right places. So if you take, for example, precision medicine in Glasgow, or if you take video games industry in Dundee, and that's Scotland, then you take renewable industries in the North East, we have got to back these industries and give them the support that is necessary. Now, that's helping training people for these jobs. It's supporting research and development so that we are the most innovative and most competitive in the world. And, of course, it's better infrastructure. And, of course, it's not helped if you cancel projects that are important to the growth. Yes, important to the growth of the North and the North East, and important eventually to Scotland and Wales, because you're actually opening up the whole economy. The problem about the infrastructure decisions we're making is it's become a political football. I mean, if you agree for 10 years, 13 years, the Conservative government has said they're going to build HS2.
Labour hasn't committed to building it either.
Hold on. They've said they would build it for 13 years that they've been in government, and then suddenly you scrap it. then there is no long-term planning for our infrastructure. I mean, high-speed rail is far more stronger in the continent of Europe than it is in Britain. I remember President...
So should Keir Starmer commit to building it any time?
Well, I remember President Mitterrand
Come on, I've asked twice now. Give us an answer.
I remember,
come on.
I will answer, of course, but I remember President Mitterrand saying that the Channel Tunnel opened up two worlds of travel. He said high-speed travel from Paris to Calais and then cross the Channel. And then he said a chance to have a leisurely look at the English countryside. And he was making fun of our inability to invest in infrastructure projects. Now, it's up to Keir Starmer what he does, but I think the issue is, are we going to take a long-term view, both about infrastructure and about the energy transition?
I was very struck by some comments you made recently in Edinburgh. I mean, you've spoken a lot about child poverty, but you talk about benefits there specifically. You said the truth is you can't live on the benefits that you receive at the moment. People are so embarrassed by their poverty that they try and hide it, but they can't in the end hide it from children who are going to school without proper clothes. So what do you want to see here? There's obviously the 2-child limit on child benefit.
I'm seeing poverty. I grew up in a town that faced the decline of the mining industry and the decline of the textile industry, and I saw poverty as I grew up, and I didn't think I would ever see it again. And this is worse poverty, and it's happening in a whole range of different communities, not just because of loss of jobs, but because of low pay. So you're getting people working all hours and then having to queue up at a food bank because they can't make ends meet. You've got children going to school ill-clad and hungry, as I was saying there, and of course families choosing between heating, eating, and indeed keeping clean because they can't afford even the hygiene goods that are necessary, from toothpaste to soap and shampoo, to keep themselves going. So we've got to do something about it. And as far as I'm concerned, we cannot allow a whole generation of children to grow up. And that's why it seems we've got a levelling down strategy at the moment, not a levelling up strategy. And if it's confirmed by this north-south divide, then it makes it even worse. So I think we need a fundamental review, root and branch review of universal credit. That is an essential element of looking at why are 4 million children now in poverty? Why is that going to rise to 5 million if we do nothing about it? Why, for example, do half the people on benefits, half the families with children on benefits, don't get the full benefit? They're suffering deductions because they've had to take a loan to get onto the benefit in the first place, and some of them paying back 20 or 30% of the benefit each fortnight in deductions from the Department of Work and Pensions. So there are families who can't make ends meet on the benefits that are announced, but there are millions of families who are actually suffering because they don't even get the benefit.
And how about the 2-child policy? I mean, many people say
that must be part of a review. As far as I can see, the child poverty amongst families with 3 children is going to be about 55% of families with 3 children. And it's going to rise for families with 4 children to something like 75% of families are going to be in poverty. So you need this review. Now, there are many things that have happened over the last 15 years, really, well, since 2010. You've got the bedroom tax, you've got the 2-child rule, you've got the cap on benefits, you've got the housing benefit not being paid in full, you've got these deductions I'm talking about. All these things have got to be taken into account to look at what is a fairer benefit system for the future.
And just finally, another big story today, a bit of a different tone, if you like. GB News has suspended Lawrence Fox and Dan Wootton for misogynistic comments that were made on air. I'm not going to repeat them. Ofcom is investigating the broadcasting watchdog. It's been criticised before as not being, effectively being pretty toothless. What's your own experience of Ofcom?
I criticised Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross when similar remarks were made almost, 15 years ago. And it led to changes in the way the programmes were done at that time. But I think we've got to look very carefully at GB News and all these broadcast companies that are emerging, because we've got a far wider range of broadcasters, and the system of regulation is not good enough to cope with it. So Ofcom needs to have more teeth to deal with issues of standards. And of course, you've got this amazing situation now. You've got internet, you've got television, you've got newspapers, and you have a completely different system of regulation for each of them. But everybody is influenced by all these social medias at one and the same time. So I think you've got to standardise some of the regulation, and certainly you can't allow people to appear on air and talk about women in the way that they're doing and without any propriety. These people have got to be kept off the air. They just cannot be allowed. I'm not in favour of censorship, but you cannot have this fall in standards and allow it to continue.
Well, Well, following the outraged response to those comments by Lawrence Fox on Dan Wootton's show, Ofcom said they were going to investigate. I spoke to the regulator's head, Dame Melanie Dawes, because I wanted to get her take on standards across the media and whether her organisation needs more teeth.
It's good to have a chance actually to explain how it works, because I know there's been quite a lot of concern and people have been talking about how this works. But fundamentally, there are rules that are set out in law by Parliament that require standards to be maintained for due impartiality and due accuracy for news and current affairs, and for audiences to be protected from harm and serious offence in all broadcasting. But all of that needs to be done while upholding freedom of expression. So what Ofcom has to do when we have a case like this is weigh all that up. Gather the facts, be really clear which part of the broadcasting code we think is a concern, talk to the broadcaster, and then, as we've done today, open an investigation if we think that's needed. But we don't shoot from the hip, and I think the public doesn't want a regulator that just gives a knee-jerk response.
I'll be honest, I feel like it's quite unusual for you to be doing an interview now, in the middle of a live investigation. It's the kind of bid we'll normally put in and then not hear anything back from. Is that an admission that you know you haven't been tough enough to this point?
No, look, I know that there's been a lot of interest in this.
And concern as well.
Yeah, there has. There's been real concern. And look, I don't want to comment particularly on the show because it is now subject to a live investigation. But I think we know that, there are real issues around misogyny more widely in our public discourse. We know from our own research at Ofcom that women are much more likely to get a hard time on social media than men and more likely to feel really affected by that. So there are definitely wider issues here.
There's also concern about elected politicians having their own shows and interviewing other elected politicians on them. I mean, so tonight, for example, the Conservative Party Deputy Chair, Lee Anderson, interviewing the Conservative Party Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. I mean, is that right?
Well, look, we are a post-broadcast regulator, so we look at programmes after they've been aired.
We've seen it many times before, haven't we?
Yeah, well, look, there are rules on politicians not being able to present the news. Those are actually set out by Parliament really clearly in the primary legislation. But when it comes to current affairs, and we've said this recently on a judgment last week, in fact, it is possible for politicians to present a show, provided that they meet the due impartiality rules and the due accuracy rules. And that doesn't mean equal balance of views, but it does mean that a sufficiently wide range of views needs to be brought to bear.
Do you really think that's happening on GB News with multiple Conservative politicians, some of them members of the government, presenting their own shows?
Well, look, we've opened up audience research into this because actually the rules haven't changed over the last 20 years, and I think that's a really good thing to have that stability. But what has changed is our media landscape. We've got more and more shows coming in on TV and radio, but also we've got that wider social media landscape. I think a lot of the time what people are seeing is actually clips on social media which don't represent the whole programme. It's Ofcom's job to look at programmes once they've been aired in the round and see whether, if you're talking about impartiality, whether that's been preserved across the programme as a whole.
I guess some people might find that quite extraordinary, what you just said, that it's a good thing that the rules haven't changed in 20 years. I mean, many people would say that's a really bad thing because the landscape has changed so dramatically. Gordon Brown last night, for example, said, because we've got a far wider range of broadcasters, the system of regulation is not good enough to cope for it. Ofcom needs to have more teeth. He's right, isn't he?
Well, certainly the government is opening up in the media bill the need to extend the number of services that we regulate to make sure that some of the streamers, for example, are caught by some form of broadcasting code that looks rather similar to what we do now for TV and radio. But I just want to say that freedom of expression, I think, is sometimes perhaps not as prominent in these debates as I think it should be. The rules are designed to uphold standards, particularly for news and current affairs, but also to preserve freedom of expression. And that's not just the freedom of expression of the broadcaster or the opinion former or the presenter. It's actually the freedom of the audience to hear a wide range of views. So,
well, even stuff like what Lawrence Fox said. I mean,
well, we are investigating that programme clearly.
I mean, that's taking freedom of expression to a real, far extremes.
Well, we are investigating that, and we've announced that today. But I do think that, the stability and flexibility of the rules has actually served us well over the years. There is a question about which services are covered by them. And as I said, we've definitely opened up audience research to get views from the public on the question of politicians presenting news and current affairs.
You're talking about the different plurality of the media, social media, broadcasting, print. It feels to me like the landscape has changed so dramatically. People are using different medias, listening to different medias. You have presenters who are acting on different media as well. Would it be better to have a cohesive system, bringing it all together, rather than a jigsaw piece?
Well, Look, I think that's a really good question, and we've done a lot of work at Ofcom, and we're doing more right now, looking at actually that question of the wider social media landscape in particular, because our research shows that if you get your news mostly from social media, from a social media feed, actually you find it harder to discriminate between real and fake news, and you're more likely actually to get stuck in a rabbit hole where you don't actually see anybody else's views on important topics. So we do think that's important, and there's not very much transparency about how those feeds are constructed or how we all get fed the diet of news and the mix of that in our day-to-day use of social media.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about as well is GB News in particular. So Michelle Donnellan spoke to me last night saying that the Lawrence Fox interview was an isolated incident. She doesn't have any wider concerns about the channel. Do you have wider concerns about the channel?
Well, we've opened up a number of investigations.
How many investigations?
We've actually got 9 ongoing live investigations and then a number that have already concluded. So, we do have a lot of engagement with GB News right now. But as I said, we welcome diversity of different programming, and I believe the rules are flexible and allow different perspectives to be able to be brought to bear.
So do you think without GB News, there's a risk that the broadcasting culture is too similar?
Well, I certainly think diversity and plurality is important. And so, as I said, freedom of expression, I think, is really important for us to remember in these debates. Ofcom's job is to uphold that while also maintaining standards.
I feel like a lot of people listening to what you're saying will think you sound quite complacent. You think that the current system works, and they'll be looking at things like what happened with Lawrence Fox, with Dan Wootton. I mean, I watched it. I was quite shocked by it, I'll be honest. They'll be looking at the fact that Lee Anderson is boasting about having the first UK soil broadcast exclusive with the Home Secretary, someone who he works with, his colleague, and thinking, why aren't you more worried?
Well, look, I don't want to come across as complacent. Clearly, we've got a really important job to do here at Ofcom, but I think we've shown by our track record that we do act. As I say, we have a number of investigations open already into GB News, more ongoing, and these standards are very, very important.
More of the highlights on Politics Hub this week coming up, including we'll discuss the worst thing a politician can be accused of, and it's probably not what you think. Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Politics Hub. Now, nobody complains when a comedian tells a joke or when a taxi driver drives a cab, but it seems the worst thing you can do if you're a politician is to play politics.
It is the right honourable gentleman that is playing politics.
Doing absolutely nothing apart from playing politics.
He prefers ambiguity and playing politics. He is merely playing politics.
Instead of playing politics on this issue, he continually wants to play politics.
A party playing politics and a government trying to help and stop playing politics. It's disappointing the honourable gentleman is seeking to play politics.
Sorry, I couldn't help laugh at that. But the Cabinet Minister, Claire Coutinho, took things to another level this morning because she posted on social media that the government, you know what I'm going to say here, don't you? We will not play politics without energy security. And then, in the next breath, criticised Keir Starmer's approach. A reminder, the Politics Hub keeps going all day, every day on the Sky News website and app. And if you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all the latest from Westminster and beyond. And we're back on your screens every Monday to Thursday night at 7 p.m. See you then.